The accident happened on a rainy Thursday. Emily Carson, just 9 years old, had been walking home from school with her father when a drunk driver ran a red light. The impact threw Emily several feet into a pole. Her father had only minor injuries, but Emily was left with multiple fractures, a punctured lung, and head trauma. When she arrived at St. Mary's Pediatric Trauma Center in Seattle, her vitals were barely stable. For the first 2 days, she didn't speak at all. The doctors did everything they could. Emily had 3 surgeries in 4 days. Her parents were told she would survive, but no one could say how complete her recovery might be. Physical pain was one thing, but emotionally, Emily had shut down. She wouldn't make eye contact. She didn't speak, not even to her mother. She stared at the ceiling, motionless, hour after hour. That's when someone suggested a therapy animal. Her mother, Rachel, reached out to a local shelter. They brought several therapy dogs to visit, but Emily didn't respond to any of them. Then one of the shelter volunteers hesitated at the last kennel. "He's not officially cleared yet," she said, pointing to a black Labrador curled silently in the back of the cage. "But he's gentle, just quiet." His name was Shadow. Found wandering the outskirts of a burned-down property in Yakima. He had no collar, no microchip, and no one ever came looking for him. He didn't bark. He didn't play. But he was calm. So still, in fact, that most assumed he was older than he really was. When Shadow entered Emily's hospital room, something changed. He walked to the foot of her bed, looked at her, and without hesitation, climbed carefully onto the side of the mattress. He curled up beside her and didn't move. Emily blinked, not much, just a twitch of her eyelids. But it was the first response she'd shown in days. That night, he stayed with her. Nurses tried to take him away for feeding, but he refused. He didn't growl, but he wouldn't budge. Finally, they allowed him to sleep on a cushion beside her bed. The next morning, Emily whispered, "Shadow." Her first word since the accident. It stunned everyone. The doctors were amazed, but to Emily's mother, it was something more. It felt like a signal that maybe her daughter was still in there, somewhere, fighting to return. From then on, Shadow never left her side. When Emily was moved to a long-term recovery room, Shadow followed. When nurses checked her IVs, he watched. When doctors examined her wounds, he stood guard. At first, everyone thought it was sweet, a dog being loyal. But then his behavior started to change. At night, around 2 a.m., he would growl softly, every single night. While looking directly at Emily, his ears would perk, and sometimes he would nudge her gently with his nose. Nurses thought he needed a walk, but once they took him out, he'd pull to go right back to her room. He didn't want to leave her alone, even for a minute. On the 5th night, Shadow's behavior escalated. Around 2:10 a.m., he began pawing at her side, not aggressively, but insistently. Then he barked, loud, sharp, and startling. The bark echoed down the hallway. A nurse came running, assuming it was just agitation. But when she checked Emily's vitals, her face drained of color. Emily's heart rate had spiked dangerously. Her breathing was shallow. The monitor hadn't caught it yet, but Shadow had. Doctors were paged immediately. After a frantic assessment, they ordered a scan. What they found made their hearts sink. Emily's spleen was rupturing, bleeding internally. The pressure had been building silently, and if not for Shadow's timely alarm, she wouldn't have made it to morning. Emergency. Surgery was performed within the hour. When it was over, and Emily was stable, Shadow curled up beside her again. Quiet, alert, and calm. The staff began to murmur. That dog saved her life. And no one, not even the most skeptical, could deny it. Shadow became a legend. In the hospital overnight, after the emergency surgery saved Emily's life, Staff started treating him with a level of respect usually reserved for surgeons. He had, without a doubt, warned them of a medical emergency no machines had detected. The ruptured spleen had been silent. No one saw it coming except the dog who wouldn't leave her side. Still, many called it coincidence. A lucky bark. But Rachel Carson, Emily's mother, didn't think so. She had seen how Shadow's behavior had built up for days. The midnight pacing, the growling, the subtle changes no one else noticed. After the operation, Emily's vitals stabilized, but Shadow's behavior didn't return to normal. He remained tense, alert, as if something else was wrong. He'd stare at her chest and neck, watching every breath. He growled when machines beeped, even at normal volumes. Once, he barked sharply when a nurse walked in with a tray, only to reveal that her blood pressure spiked dramatically minutes later due to an allergic reaction to a new medication. The staff was unsettled. It wasn't that Shadow was disruptive. It was that he was accurate. He barked when something was about to go wrong, not after. A few nurses began taking notes of his behavior. One of them, Sarah, even started logging Shadow's body language as part of Emily's health chart. And then, something even more bizarre happened. One afternoon, as Rachel was helping Emily sit upright in bed, Shadow lunged, not toward Emily, but at a nurse, not violently, but forcefully. He stood in front of Emily, blocking the nurse from getting closer. His fur bristled, his stance rigid. Rachel froze. "Shadow, no," she whispered, tugging on his collar. But the dog refused to move. The nurse looked startled but smiled. "It's okay. I've got her meds," she said, holding up a small paper cup. A moment later, another nurse ran in, calling out, "Wait, don't give that. That's not her medication." Everyone in the room paused. The nurse holding the cup paled. The pills had been intended for a different patient, an adult. The dosage would have overwhelmed Emily's small system, possibly causing seizures or even cardiac arrest. An investigation began immediately. It turned out the nurse had been diverting medications, stealing painkillers meant for children and swapping them with cheap, over-the-counter lookalikes. Shadow had known. Somehow, he had sensed danger again. Not medical this time, but human. The security team was shocked. Hospital administration moved swiftly. The nurse was fired and arrested. And Shadow? He became more than just Emily's companion. He was now considered part of her protective care. The hospital updated its policies. The next day, officially recognizing Shadow as a certified emotional support animal for Emily. He was given his own ID badge, a small blanket with the hospital logo, and access to areas most pets were never allowed. Doctors still couldn't explain it. One theory was that Shadow had military or police training, but the shelter had no record of his past. Another theory was that he had developed a hyper-attunement to Emily's condition, able to smell chemical changes or detect subtle cues even advanced. Machines couldn't pick up. Whatever the reason, he had saved her twice. Rachel watched her daughter every day, wondering if Emily would ever fully recover, emotionally and physically. But one thing was clear. Shadow wasn't just part of her healing. He was the reason she was still alive. One evening, Rachel asked softly, "Why do you think he picked you, sweetheart?" Emily, still weak but smiling, whispered, "He didn't pick me, Mommy. I think I picked him from far away." Rachel didn't know what that meant. But as she looked at the dog, curled up beside the hospital bed, always watching, always waiting, she began to wonder if fate really had a paw in all this. Shadow's story didn't stay inside the hospital walls for long. A young intern posted a photo of Shadow sitting beside Emily's bed, eyes alert, her tiny hand resting on his paw. The caption read, "He saved her life, twice." The photo exploded online. News outlets picked it up. Within days, TV crews lined the sidewalks outside St. Mary's Hospital. Journalists wanted interviews. Animal lovers sent letters and gifts, and local children drew pictures of Shadow in superhero capes. CNN ran a segment called The Dog Who Could Detect What Doctors Missed. Talk shows called Shadow a miracle. But for Emily's family, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about a dog who had become something much deeper than a pet. Shadow had become her lifeline. Amid the attention, hospital staff became protective. Shadow was moved through back hallways to avoid crowds. Emily's mother requested no interviews, but attention came anyway. Shadow had fans. People mailed bones, blankets, even a custom vest that read Emily's Guardian. Yet, in the middle of the praise and cameras, Shadow was changing again out at night. He wouldn't sleep. He stared at walls. He growled lowly. When certain people entered, he whined at odd times, even when Emily seemed fine. A nurse named Sarah noticed that every time Shadow growled at 3 a.m., Emily's blood pressure would spike around 4 a.m. Then came the most unsettling moment yet. During a routine scan, Emily was wheeled out of her room. Shadow followed closely, but was asked to wait in the hallway. As the scan began, a technician inserted a contrast dye into Emily's VO. Suddenly, from outside the room, Shadow let out a loud, piercing bark, one that echoed through the radiology wing. Nurses rushed in. Emily was struggling to breathe. She was having a reaction to the contrast dye. A rare allergy. The technician had never seen it before. The emergency team stabilized her within minutes, but everyone had the same thought. How did Shadow know again? The hospital director, Dr. Marcus Ellison, called a private meeting with Rachel Carson. "I know this sounds odd," he said, "but we're starting to think Shadow's behavior might be predictive. He reacts before things happen, not after." Rachel nodded. "I've felt that since day one." Dr. Ellison continued, "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years. I've seen instinct. I've seen lucky guesses. This isn't that. Your dog may be sensing things none of us can. Not machines, not staff. We want to study him." Rachel hesitated. "You're not going to take him away from her, are you?" "No." The doctor smiled. "We just want to understand. Because if what he's doing can be taught, we might be looking at a new kind of care." News of Shadow's third intervention spread like wildfire. A university research team contacted the hospital, offering to fund a study. Animal behaviorists wanted access. Former police dog trainers requested video footage. Theories poured in. Everything from heightened olfactory detection to some kind of sixth sense developed by trauma. But amid all the science, Emily was still recovering. Her legs were healing, her lungs stronger, but her voice remained quiet. Only Shadow heard her speak much, and only when they were alone. Doctors encouraged therapy, but Emily resisted. Until one day, during a visit from the mayor, Emily surprised everyone. The room was full of cameras and reporters. The mayor bent down and asked, "Emily, is this your hero?" Emily nodded. Then, she leaned forward, kissed Shadow's head, and whispered, "He's not just my hero. He's my voice." Everyone froze. Rachel cried. The mayor stood speechless. And Shadow? He licked Emily's hand once, and returned to watching the door. Shadow had become more than a story. He had become a phenomenon. After the mayor's visit and Emily's whisper, the photo of her kissing his head was on the cover of every major newspaper by morning. Time called him the dog who warned death away. Celebrities tweeted support. Donations to the hospital's pediatric wing doubled. Animal rights organizations offered to sponsor Shadow's food, care, even future medical costs. But all the attention couldn't explain how he did what he did. The mystery deepened when a call came into the hospital one afternoon from a man in Montana. He had seen the news coverage and recognized Shadow immediately. "His name isn't Shadow," the man said over the phone. "It's Ranger." Rachel, the hospital, and the shelter all listened as the man, a retired Marine named Daniel Voss, shared the story. He had been stationed in Afghanistan as part of a trauma recovery unit that helped soldiers cope with post-traumatic stress. One program experimented with pairing dogs to veterans prone to seizures, flashbacks, and unpredictable breakdowns. These dogs were trained in a specialized military K-9 initiative, taught not only to detect seizures and panic attacks, but also early-onset neurological reactions triggered by memory or trauma. Shadow, or rather, Ranger, had been one of the best. He wasn't just trained to sit or bark, Daniel said. He was trained to sense chemical changes in human sweat, heart rhythm shifts, even faint tremors in the body. If he's with that girl, and he's alerting, it's not luck. It's because he knows something's coming. Rachel listened. Stunned, Daniel continued. When his handler died in combat, Ranger was shipped home. Somewhere along the line, the paperwork was lost. Some dogs were reassigned. Others abandoned. Rachel's throat tightened. "You're telling me they just let him go?" "It happens more than you think," Daniel replied. But somehow, he found his purpose again. The next day, Daniel flew out to meet Shadow. As he entered the hospital room, Shadow lifted his head, stood up, and slowly approached the man. He sniffed him, then sat, quiet and calm. "He remembers," Daniel said, "but he's made a new bond now. That girl is his mission. It made sense now. The precise alerts, the deep connection, the protective instinct that went beyond emotional support." Shadow wasn't just a rescue dog. He had been a rescuer long before Emily. Hospital staff were in awe. One of the neurologists, Dr. Sophie Lerner, requested to study Shadow's response during Emily's next monitoring session. She placed advanced sensors on Emily's skin and Shadow's fur to analyze patterns. What they found was stunning. Shadow's posture changed 5 minutes before. Emily's heart rate spiked. He began to pace 3 minutes before her breathing became erratic. And just before her blood pressure dropped slightly, he placed his paw on her chest, like he was anchoring her. Doctor Lerner said it best. It's not science fiction. It's survival instinct, trained, honed, and now tied to this child's life. The hospital decided to expand their therapy dog program, starting with a new initiative named after him, Ranger's Watch. It would seek out abandoned service animals, retrain shelter dogs, and pair them with at-risk pediatric patients. Rachel was overwhelmed, but Emily only smiled. "He was always meant to find me," she whispered later that night. When the hospital halls were quiet and the world outside buzzing with praise, Shadow sat beside Emily, eyes scanning the room. Not for cameras. Not for fame, but for anything that might hurt the girl he had chosen to protect. The girl whose soul matched his own. Battered, but still fighting. And as always, he never closed both eyes at the same time. Emily's strength was returning. She could sit up longer, walk a few slow laps around the therapy hallway, and even began whispering full sentences to her nurses. Every milestone was celebrated, but Shadow remained on high alert. The hospital was calmer now. Media presence had been reduced, and administrators enforced strict visitor limits to give Emily space. Shadow still slept beside her bed every night. And every night, just before lights out, he stood up and walked to the door, inspecting the hallway, then curled up again, always between Emily and the rest of the world. But something was changing. Shadow was tense again. He started pacing more often and no longer slept through the night. His eyes darted around the room. He would nudge Emily's shoulder repeatedly and sit upright, watching her face closely. Rachel noticed. "It's like he's waiting for something," she told the nurse, who nodded but didn't seem concerned. Doctors assured her it was probably anxiety from the many people, smells, and routines Shadow had experienced. "He's probably exhausted," one said. "He's been through a lot too." But Rachel trusted Shadow more than machines. And her instinct was right. It happened during a routine physical therapy session. Emily was practicing her balance, stepping across a padded mat with a physical therapist nearby. Shadow wasn't far, just a few feet away, watching from the edge of the mat. Suddenly, Shadow stood and began barking. 1, 2, 3 sharp barks. He lunged forward, placing himself between Emily and the therapist. Everyone froze, and Emily's eyes rolled back. Her legs buckled. The therapist lunged to catch her just before her head hit the mat. A seizure erupted, her first ever. Medical staff swarmed the room within seconds. Rachel arrived screaming. Shadow sat frozen in the middle of the room, staring at her, unmoving. Like a statue, tense, focused, as if willing her body to stay alive. It lasted 30 seconds. But to everyone watching, it felt eternal. Emily was stabilized, sedated, and moved to ICU. Tests followed, and more tests. After 3 days, a neurologist came in with the results. Emily had a rare form of neurological inflammation, likely triggered by the trauma of the accident. It was affecting her brain's electrical activity, causing microseizures that were invisible on surface scans and difficult to detect until they fully erupted. The doctor was stunned. "We might never have caught it this early without what happened." Rachel stared. "Without Shadow." The doctor nodded. Further tests confirmed that Shadow had reacted before Emily showed outward signs. Chemical levels in her sweat, breath, or possibly the tremors in her muscles. Whatever it was, he had noticed the shift. A new plan was made. Shadow would now be involved directly in treatment. Nurses monitored not only Emily's vitals, but also Shadow's behaviors. They charted his pacing, his barks, even when he stared too long at one spot. Surprisingly, it all correlated. The head of neurology, Dr. Lerner, made it official. He is part of the care team now. Shadow received a tag for his collar that read Medical Support Canine. Emily Carson, seizure detection. Rachel finally exhaled after what felt like months. But what struck her most wasn't just the science. It was the way Emily, still weak, whispered Shadow's name after the seizure, her first words in 2 days. She looked him in the eyes and said, "I knew you'd stop it." Shadow only wagged his tail once. Then he lay beside her bed again, waiting, always waiting, because Emily wasn't just recovering. She was walking a line between healing and relapse. And Shadow knew it. He could smell it, feel it, and he would never let her fall alone again. The ICU room was dim, filled with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the hum of machines. But more than any equipment, it was Shadow's presence that gave Rachel peace. He lay beside Emily's bed, head resting on her ankle, eyes watching every breath she took. Since the seizure, Emily's condition had been closely monitored. She was stable now, but unpredictable. Her rare neurological disorder made it hard for doctors to anticipate when the next episode would strike. But Shadow, he already knew. He'd proven it again just 2 nights ago. At 1:46 a.m., Shadow stood, suddenly ears twitching. He sniffed the air, then barked once. The on-duty nurse, used to his signals by now, checked Emily's vitals. Everything looked normal. But within 3 minutes, Emily began to tremble. Another seizure. This one smaller, but dangerous nonetheless. From that point on, the hospital staff didn't just chart Emily's condition. They charted Shadow's movements too. Dr. Sophie Lerner initiated a protocol. Every time Shadow barked, growled, or showed agitation, nurses recorded the time and nature of his behavior. She even brought in a small team of veterinary neurologists and canine behaviorists to monitor his reactions using thermal cameras and easy sensors. The results were undeniable. Shadow's body tensed before changes in Emily's heart rate. His gaze followed invisible cues just seconds before electrical brain activity spiked. He pawed her hand seconds before blood pressure dropped. One neurologist shook his head. "We're looking at a dog with a neurological radar stronger than our own machines." Dr. Lerner smiled. Not just a radar, a bond. She was right. Emily and Shadow had developed something that couldn't be taught, not fully. During therapy sessions, if Emily was agitated, Shadow would rest his head on her leg. Her breathing would slow. If her eyes flickered in fear, he'd nudge her hand. She responded to him more than any therapist, any doctor, even her parents. Their communication was silent, instinctive. Rachel sat by and watched it unfold daily. It was more than companionship. It was survival. She often found herself crying without meaning to, not out of sadness, but gratitude. "He's more than a guardian," she once said to Dr. Lerner. "He's her second nervous system." The hospital made it official. Shadow was added as an honorary member of the neurology team. A badge was printed with his photo, and nurses hung it above his bed. Shadow Carson, Seizure Response Unit. But there was more. Inspired by the unprecedented connection, the hospital launched a pilot program under the pediatric wing, Shadow's Watch. The goal was to retrain abandoned service dogs, especially those like Shadow, forgotten, misplaced, or traumatized, and pair them with children recovering from neurological trauma, long-term illness, or PTSD. Volunteers poured in. Within a month, 6 rescued dogs were undergoing training. 2 had already been matched with children. Shadow became the face of the program. News crews returned. But this time, the story wasn't just about survival. It was about hope. Emily, now stronger, even agreed to a short recorded message. Sitting in her wheelchair, with Shadow resting beside her, she whispered into the microphone, "He hears things I can't say." That line hit every heart that watched. As the media attention spread once again. Donations flooded in, not just money, but food, medical supplies, and training materials for dogs in the program. But for Emily, it was simple. She was healing. Slowly, but surely. And every step she took, Shadow was right there, not leading, not following. Just beside her, because healing wasn't something Emily had to do alone anymore. She had a partner now, one who didn't need words to understand when the storm was coming, and one who would never let her face it alone. Emily's story was no longer just about survival. It had grown into something much larger. Her battle had become the spark behind a movement, and at the center of it all was Shadow, her silent guardian, now a symbol of second chances. Shadow's Watch, the hospital's pilot therapy dog program, had gone from concept to reality in record time. By spring, 6 dogs had been fully trained. All were former rescues like Shadow, unwanted, overlooked, or discarded. Now, they were walking hospital halls with new purpose, beside children battling diseases, recovering from surgeries, or coping with trauma. The transformation was stunning. One child, an 8-year-old boy named Theo recovering from brain surgery, hadn't spoken in weeks, and a golden retriever named Marley laid his head in the boy's lap. Hours later, Theo whispered, "Good boy." It was the first time he had used words since his operation. These stories started becoming common. Shadow, however, remained Emily's constant. He didn't warm up easily to the other dogs or handlers. His focus stayed on his girl. Even as Emily grew stronger, beginning to take slow, steady walks down the hospital garden path, Shadow followed a step behind, never distracted, always scanning. But he was aging. The long days and months had taken a toll. Shadow moved a bit slower now. His naps grew longer, his reactions slightly delayed. Doctors and handlers began quietly preparing Rachel for the truth. Shadow might not be able to do this forever. Rachel struggled with the thought. One morning, she sat with Dr. Lerner in the staff lounge, tears forming in her eyes. How do I tell her that he might not be strong enough to protect her soon? Dr. Lerner replied gently, You don't have to. He already is. Those words stayed with her. A month later, the hospital hosted a fundraising gala for the expanding dog therapy program. Emily had been invited to speak. She was nervous, her small hands trembling as she held her note cards, but she insisted on going. That night, dressed in a light blue dress with her arm gently linked through Rachel's, she walked on stage. With Shadow at her side, the audience stood as one. Applause thundered through the hall. But Emily raised one hand to signal for silence. When the crowd grew quiet, she knelt beside Shadow and whispered, Can you sit with me while I talk? He obeyed instantly. Sitting tall beside her, Emily looked out at the sea of people and began, This is my best friend, Shadow. I didn't know how to talk about pain before I met him. I didn't know how to ask for help, but I didn't need to ask. He already knew. He saved me, again and again, without ever using words. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. She continued, her voice steady. I think Shadow was meant to be thrown away once, so he could find me. And I think maybe I was meant to be broken for a little while, so he could help fix me. By the end, the entire audience was silent, overwhelmed. That night, the foundation raised enough money to expand Shadow's watch statewide. Shadow, unaware of his growing fame, rested beside Emily's chair, head on her foot, completely calm. Cameras flashed. Reporters begged for interviews. But Shadow wasn't interested. His eyes never left her. He had watched her fall apart. He had watched her come back. And now he watched her stand, not as a patient, but as a voice for every child who ever felt forgotten. Because even though he couldn't speak, Shadow had taught Emily to never be silent again. The day Emily was discharged from the hospital, the staff lined the hallway. Nurses, doctors, therapists, volunteers, all stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding balloons, others holding back tears. The double doors at the end of the pediatric wing had been decorated with paper paw prints and a hand-painted banner that read, Thank you, Shadow. Emily stood at one end of the hallway, wearing a pale yellow hoodie and jeans. Her hair had grown longer since the accident, her face fuller, color back in her cheeks. She looked healthier, braver, like someone who had survived something few could understand. Shadow stood beside her, wearing a navy blue vest that read Medical Support Retired. He had officially completed his last shift. Emily looked up at her mom, then took a deep breath. She grabbed Shadow's leash with one hand and Rachel's hand with the other, and they walked every few steps. People clapped or waved. Some handed small notes, others whispered words of thanks. But Shadow didn't stop. His pace was slow but steady. He never turned his head or got distracted by the noise. His eyes remained fixed on the door. He had done this walk many times before, from the garden to the therapy room, from the ICU to recovery. But this time, it was different. This time, he was walking her out. For good. When they reached the doors, Rachel opened them slowly. Sunshine poured into the hallway. Emily blinked against the light. Outside, reporters waited behind barricades. But the hospital had arranged for a quiet exit. A black SUV waited at the curb. Emily turned to face the staff. Thank you for saving me, she said, her voice soft but clear. Then she turned to Shadow, knelt, and whispered loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. You don't have to worry anymore. I'm okay now. Shadow licked her cheek once. Single tail wagged Dot. Then they walked into the sunlight together. Dot at home. Things were quieter, simpler. Rachel had prepared Emily's room exactly the way it had been before the accident. The same posters on the walls. The same books on her shelves. But now, beside her bed, was a new addition. A soft orthopedic dog bed with Shadow's name stitched. On the side, in gold thread. That first night, Shadow curled up on it for only a few minutes. Then, as he always had, he stood, walked to Emily's bedside, and laid down right next to her. He stayed that way through the night, Dot, but for the